Is this an overwhelming amount of books for an intro to fantasy video for someone coming into the genre nice and fresh? Potentially, but will this video also give you a good idea of what you should go into next, where you should start your fantasy reading journey, what sort of books and styles of fantasy might be for you? I hope so. My name is Dylan. I've been a fantasy reader my entire life on and off. I've been a consistent full-time reader the last 4 years, and the last 2 years I've been a consistent fantasy reader. I discovered one of these series whilst I was going through a bookstore, absolutely just got infatuated by the cover, but then fell in love with the series. Then I went onto YouTube, searched up a video looking for the best reads in fantasy, found another one of these series here, and I have been addicted ever since. I've worked my way through more than 150 fantasy books now, over 30 fantasy series. And of course, now I have my own channel where I talk about these books. So now I want to give back and help you find your next read and help you get started in the genre of fantasy. Whether you're like me and just found some random fantasy book at some point and really enjoyed it and want to try more of the genre, whether you've just come into the genre and haven't started anything before, or you used to read it when you're growing up, and then when you went to uni or college, or got started in your career, you stopped reading and you're getting back into it, I think you should be able to find something in this video to help you reignite your fantasy reading journey. Now, I have got quite a few books here. There are quite a few series I wanted to go over and cover because fantasy is a broad genre and I wanted to make sure we have something for everyone, but also want to help cover all the big series in the space at the moment so you know where you want to go with your reading once you've picked your first series. So when I sat down to make this video and was thinking about what series I would recommend people starting with when they're getting into fantasy, I just thought, why not start with the best and talk about a variety of different styles of books, as this is a very varied genre. There's lots of different styles to fantasy. So to give you a good taste for everything, I went on to Reddit and went on Reddit's voted top fantasy series of all time. And I wanted to go through the top 15 with you, just break down a little bit what each series is about, how many books there are, how many books you could get away with reading if you didn't want to read an entire series or an entire universe of books. Because some of these series are like the MCU, where there's like you've got Iron Man, you've got Captain America, and there's like little things that link between them, but you can also watch them by themselves. And then on top of those 15 series, 3 of which I'll be talking about are space operas. So they're not exactly just the fantasy series you're used to. There are some sci-fi elements, but they feel very fantasy. And we'll talk about them first. So if you want to skip over them, we can get them out of the way. Then I also want to talk about 3 other series that I think are fantastic intros to fantasy that I wanted to include in this top 15. So let's start with this list. At number 15, we had Dune. Now, if you haven't seen the recent Dune movies coming out, you mustn't be a movie person, as they're the only movies worth watching since The Elderlings came out. Now, that's not entirely true, but the Dune books are absolutely incredible. These probably aren't the first books you would read if English isn't your first language, as Frank Herbert writes in a bit more of a philosophical manner. He uses a third-person omniscient POV perspective. So when you're reading his books, you are, from paragraph to paragraph, jumping from one character's head to another. So it makes for a very immersive, full-on reading experience where you can just really get into it with every single character in the books. You get a really good religious and political story with Dune. If you haven't seen the movies or haven't heard about Dune before, this is set in the far, far future where humans have colonized a galaxy where there's a mineral called spice that everyone wants to get their hands on, as it allows you to travel around space much easier. And you can only really get it on this one planet of Arrakis, where one family has basically controlled the market for spice for years, and the Emperor decides to turn that around and give that planet to another family. And that basically sets off a huge political drama in this world. But there's a deeply religious side to this story that you'll find underneath. So you'll find in the books the action isn't as heavy. This is deeper in the politics and the themes, more so than in the action like you would see in the movies. Incredible story. Dune can be read as a standalone book. Then you could also read the book after it, Dune Messiah, and kind of think of that as an epilogue to Dune, just wrapping up the events of the first book. Then you could also read it as a trilogy, finishing off with Children of Dune. There are dozens of books in the Dune universe. After the author Frank Herbert passed away, his son continued to write in this world. but it's often considered in the community that the first 4 books are the best 4, and after that, things get a little bit too weird. So you could read Dune as a standalone, as a trilogy, or the first 4 finishing off with God Emperor of Dune, and you have a good time there. Moving on to number 14 on the list, I don't have the physical copies here. It's Red Rising by Pierce Brown. So this is another space opera set about 800 years in the future, where corporations have gone and populated the rest of our solar system and kind of got too big for their britches. They've taken over any sort of government there, and now the society that humans live in is a caste society. So we have the golds at the top, reds at the bottom, a bunch of other color systems in between. And in this series, which is 7 books but can be broken up into a trilogy and a quartet, we have a red, someone right from the bottom of society who tries to infiltrate the golds of this society and rise up to bring them down from within. So this is a very dark and action-heavy series. So where Dune is a bit more of a slower read where you're jumping from characters' heads, in Red Rising, there's one main POV for the first 3 books, and you're in his head and with him the whole time. And that's while he's trying to infiltrate and bring down society. And then in the next 4 books, which we're waiting for the last one for, there's a 10-year time jump, and we now get a multi-POV story. But these books are fast-paced, action-packed. The themes in the story are still deep. It's very dark, but you'll read these books very quickly. And little warning, the first book in this series isn't as good as the rest of the books. So if you come off feeling like the first book's more like a 3.5 out of 5, I would recommend continuing because they do make a markedly improved jump up from the next. Now, the next space opera I have here didn't make the list on Reddit, but I wanted to talk about it as it's been getting massively more popular recently, and that's the Sun Eater series by Christopher Rocchio. Now, if you watched Dune and loved that, if you are a big fan of Star Wars, and if you are a big fan of just beautiful writing, this is a series you're going to want to get into. There's currently 6 books out in the Sun Eater series, with the 7th set to come out later this year. This is a story written to us by the main character. Our main character in the first page of the first book tells us, "Hi, I'm Hadrian Marlowe. I'm known as the Sun Eater. I blew up a sun to wipe out an enemy alien race, and I killed my emperor at the same time. Here's my story." And he's writing to us, telling us the tales of how he tried to deal with this enemy threat to human society. There's a lot of action in this series. There's a lot of archaeology and discovery in this series. This is one of the best space operas out there. Now, when you do start this series, what I want to warn you is the pacing takes a while to get there. In book 1, the author is showing off how good of a writer he is. He's showing off the world, but he's not really showing us the plot. The plot is kind of over to the side. In book 2 of the series, our author is now finding the plot, and we're starting to move things a little bit quicker, but it's not till book 3 where our author starts to run with the plot and get the story going. But from the midpoint of book 2, you've got a clear picture of what's going on, and you're going to have a great time. So if you want some really beautiful writing that's still really easy to read, a main character that you're not necessarily going to like, but you're still going to cheer for, and so just some incredible action, some incredible space battles, you are going to want to get on to Sun Eater. But now it's time to return to our Reddit list and get back to the fantasy series. So at number 13, we have the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, this is a very, very popular series, and the only reason these books are at number 13 and not higher on the list is because Patrick hasn't finished these books off yet. We are not guaranteed to get the last book in this trilogy, as the author's been saying he's going to write it for about the last 13 years now, and we haven't had too much news on it in the last few years, but The Name of the Wind, book 1 of this series, is often touted as people's favourite fantasy book. Now, I haven't read these 2 books myself. I've read the first 60 pages of book 1, and these books have incredible writing. Everyone will tell you Patrick Rothfuss's prose is some of the best in fantasy. It's very descriptive, it's very lyrical, it's very poetic, it's very beautiful to read. He sets up and builds a very beautiful world, and this story, kind of like Sun Eater, is the main character of the story telling us about their past, which is the main story. He's telling us his tales. He's telling us he went to university at a very young age, and how he's an incredible magician and poet, and how he's slayed dragons and done all these incredible things. So you get his tales in here in a very beautifully written manner. It's a huge epic fantasy world and loved by many. Just be warned, these books may never be finished. Now, coming in at number 12, We have the Harry Potter books by J.K. Rowling. If you haven't seen the movies or heard of these books, what are you doing? What century have you been living in? These books are perfectly fine. I read them for the first time myself when I was in my early 20s, and I had a good time with them. But they're not exactly where I'd get back into reading fantasy. Like, if you loved the movies, of course, definitely check out Harry Potter. They are good mystery fantasy novels, but because of how popular they are and how much time I can ramble about books, we'll move on quickly and we'll go to number 11, which another series like the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss, The Gentleman Bastards by Scott Lynch, are one of these fantasy series that are not finished. This is a series I haven't read yet, but basically this is a heist-themed fantasy story set in a portside city and on ships. The highlight of this series for a lot of people is the character dynamic between Locke and John. They have a very fun comedic sort of back and forth, so it makes for a very fun reading experience. You get that heist feel where that you're always cooking up a scheme and a plan. I don't think the magic is too high in this series, and you can read The Lies of Locke and Lamora as kind of a standalone without having to worry about getting into the next few books of the series and not having the next book come out, as they believe it's been 11 to 12 years since the previous book came out, and there's a planned 7 books in this series, but again, we won't know if that will come out. So you want to be aware of that going into it. But if you want a fun, heist-themed story based in a port city and then on some ships, this is something you should probably check out. It's something I really want to get into, but just haven't got to yet. Now, top 10 on the Reddit list. At number 10, we have a series I just recently read, The Greenbone Saga by Fonda Lee. This is a really good series if you want something a bit more modern in your fantasy. It's very common for fantasy books to be set in like a medieval sort of time period, but the Greenbone Saga is set in a world that is inspired by our world in around like the 1950s, and the countries this story is set in are Asian-inspired countries that have kind of like a very honorable martial arts sort of feel to them. And the story we're following is a Godfather-esque story. We're following a country that has this mineral called jade, which enhances people's abilities so they can get stronger, faster, and react quicker. They can do these sorts of things. So this is a very sought after mineral. It's a very small country that has access to this mineral, and 2 mobs basically have control over this. So you get a Godfather feel with all the mobs and the mafia dynamics. So it's a very political story. It's a lot more modern story. There's some really good action, and the writing style for this is really accessible, where some of our authors here, they like to go off and get very descriptive with their prose. Fonda Lee keeps her writing very simple and accessible, so you can just fly through these books very quickly. So they look pretty big and chunky, you can get through these quickly, have a great time. There's some really good characters. There's a lot of good politicking, so you can have a great time there. It's just a nice, easy trilogy you can get in and out of. Then at number 9 on this list, we have Malazan, Book of the Fallen. Now, this is a funny series to talk about into a video that is called Intro to Fantasy or A Beginner's Guide to Fantasy, because this is often called like the masterclass of fantasy. This is often the big boss of the genre, where people would recommend you read other series before getting to Malazan, because what Malazan does is it throws you right in the deep end. In the first book, Gardens of the Moon, you get 33 POVs. So you are getting in the head of 33 different characters. So that's a lot of characters to follow, and you're getting thrown into the middle of a story. So you have to pay attention a lot to understand what is going on. But basically, Malazan, Book of the Fallen by Stephen Erickson is the story of the Malazan Empire in a very pivotal moment. This story is set in a huge world. The magic systems, the amount of magic, the amount of different magical beings and creatures in this series is off the charts. The amount of lore in this world is crazy. So there's a lot of things going on, and there's a lot of new terms. There'll be a lot of new characters to pick up when you go into this series. So it might not be a great starting point for getting into fantasy unless you've read a lot of other things in the past, because there is a lot of storylines going on of all the different sides of the people, both inside and outside the empire, trying to take over cities, trying to hold cities, trying to flee from captors. And this story jumps around. The story we get in book 1 lines up with the story you get in book 3 of this series. The story you get in book 2 of this series, completely separate to book 1, just a few carryover characters, connects to book 4. Then things come together in book 5. So things get a bit hectic with Malazan. That's why you won't see Malazan recommended to anyone getting into the genre. Though I myself have actually given this series and recommended it to someone that doesn't normally read fantasy, because this person that I'm getting into it loves playing tabletop games. And Malazan Book of the Fallen was actually originally a tabletop game between Stephen, Ian C. Esmond, and one of their friends. Ian C. Esmond is another author who has also written in this same world, kind of like if Stephen Erickson wrote the Avengers and Ian C. Esmond wrote the Loki TV series, kind of like that sort of thing. But this is based off a tabletop game they played out. So if you have that background and love for deep magic systems and lore in worlds, and you want to get just the most full-on experience with beautiful prose, huge world building, and tons of magic, you might have a fun time with Malazan. But just be warned, it's overwhelming for most people, even well-read people. Now, going into number 8, we have The Discworld by Terry Pratchett. Now, this is, again, one of those book series that has lots of different series. Discworld is over 40 books long, but this isn't a series that you just read in chronological order where we have to go 1, 2, then 3. Terry Pratchett loves the format of story, but he also loves social commentary. So he uses each of his books as a point to educate and say something about the world that he wants to get out there. Now, the Discworld books that I've read are the Moist von Lipwig books and the Night's Watch books. And I would say Discworld are the books that you go to when you want something lighthearted and fun, when you want a compelling story that'll also have you chuckling and get you thinking deeper whilst not having to think as deeply as you would, for example, with something like Malazan. They are usually shorter reads. They feel a little bit quirky and whimsical, but there's always a good message behind them. One of my favourite books of all time is Going Postal, which is the first book in the Moist von Lipwig trilogy. And we take a con man who has been caught by the city and the governor general or dictator for this city. It's a very fun dynamic. He puts our guy Moist in charge of the post office, which has been defunct for years because this world now has a clax system, which basically has a monopoly on the communication industry, and our cheeky con man has to get the post office up and running again. It's a fun story on just like the communication industry and monopolies and big corporations. I highly recommend checking it out. If you want a fun, compelling story with really good characters and just full of laughs, you should check out Discworld by Terry Pratchett. Then at number 7, we have The Realm of the Elderlings by Robin Hobb. The Realm of the Elderlings is 5 separate series that is also one series. So this is 16 books long. There's 4 trilogies and 1 quartet. The first trilogy is the Farseer trilogy, and this is your classic fantasy story. So we're in that medieval setting, but we get a lot of different flavors of story in this one world. So in our first trilogy, the Farseer trilogy, we get our coming-of-age story. We get Fitz, our main character for 3 of the trilogies in The Realm of the Elderlings, and we get him as a young boy coming into his early 20s across these 3 books. Fitz is a bastard to the royal family in the 6 duchies where this story takes place. So we get his outlook around this kingdom that is having to deal with some raiders at this time. There's a lot of politicking in these books. There's a lot of your classic coming of age tropes in these books. Robin Hobb's writing is very accessible. It's very easy to read, but it's also very descriptive and very cozy. It's a very immersive experience reading a Robin Hobb book. Her prose is one of my favorites. It's just, you feel like when you're reading her books, you're sitting in front of the fire with a warm blanket over the top of you. Her books are more character and character dynamic focused. So if you're looking for an action-heavy read, this probably isn't the series for you. But if you want to see just a character go through a lot of hard times and just try to come through on the other side, just get beaten up by the author, this is a series you should check out. You spend 9 books with Fitz, and then there's 2 other series in between called the Live Ship Traders and the Rainwild Chronicles. I am currently in the middle of the Live Ship Traders. It's one of the best trilogies I have ever read. This is a multi-POV story. We get like a family drama in a nautical setting with a lot of politicking. The character dynamics are grating because you just feel frustrated the whole time just because the characters all feel so real, and the politicking is just super interesting. If you want a drama but in a fantasy world, the Live Ship Traders is a fantastic series, so you should definitely get onto Robin Hobb. Going into number 6, we have The Wheel of Time. So you may have seen the new Amazon Prime adaptation for this series and you may be wanting to check it out, I will warn you with The Wheel of Time. It is 14 books long, and there is about 4 books in the middle there, books 7 through 10, that often get called the slog. I personally read the first 6 books and got halfway through the 7th book of The Wheel of Time before I had to put this series down because it just felt like it was dragging on a bit too much for me. This is going to be your classic fantasy story again. So that medieval sort of time period, but there's a lot of fantasy elements to this series with other fantasy races and beings, lots of magic. This is a huge world with tons of different cultures. Robert Jordan has built an incredible world here. He writes big stories. He has a lot of different characters that we're following. There's a lot of different plot lines, and he's just weaving something huge. And most people that get through 14 books in this series call it their favorite series of all time. So if you just want a big classic fantasy and you're willing to read 14 massive books, you definitely should check out The Wheel of Time. Although it's not something I love myself, I definitely can see why this is one of the top 6 most loved books of all time on Reddit's fantasy list. And it has a very accessible writing style. You won't trip over your words reading The Wheel of Time. You will know what's going on and you'll have a very clear picture in your head of just this huge epic story. So if you love plot, if you love world building, this is a series for you. Just understand sometimes people find Robert gets a bit bogged down in certain places and doesn't seem to rush through things as much as you may want him to. But we are now up to the top 5, and I'm really excited for this, especially this next one, as we have our first Brandon Sanderson series. Now, when you're getting into fantasy, you're going to hear a lot about Brandon Sanderson. He is the biggest name in the genre at the moment. He just released a book called Wind and Truth, which is the 5th book in his Stormlight Archive series, and that basically broke the internet. It wasn't received with as much love as some of his other books, but he is one of the most loved authors in the genre. He talks to his fans. He has a lot of books. He basically has an MCU of his own, which he calls the Cosmere. And one of the series that takes place in his Cosmere on a planet called Scadrial is the Mistborn series. Mistborn is broken up into 2 eras currently, and there's going to be 4 eras in total. The first era, Mistborn Era 1, is a trilogy, and it is a fantastic book. This is a fantastic series. This is the second series I read when I was getting back into fantasy. I sped through these books so quickly. Brandon Sanderson is a master of world building, plot, and creating magic systems. What Brandon is known for is his hard magic systems, where he writes magic where his rules are on the page. All of our authors here, they have magic in their books, but not all of them tell us the rules to their magic. They kind of leave that hidden away so the author knows, but we don't. With Brandon's books, he has the rules written in the back in the glossary. You know exactly how his magic systems work. And for the magic system in Mistborn, some of our characters are able to digest metals and burn them in their body, so then they can get certain abilities where they can push and pull on metal objects or influence people's thoughts or make themselves stronger. It's a very fun and interesting magic system. We are in a world that is just coated in ash. There's an oppressive lord ruler who's been ruling for the last 1,000 years. Then there's a divide between the people. There is the high class and then there is the slaves. And basically a few of our slaves kind of have some access to this magic. A few of them are Mistborns, so they have access to all the burning metal abilities. Some people only have access to one of those abilities, and then just a select few have access to all of them. And we're just following a crew of misfits, a heist crew, so you get that heist feel in this series as they try to overthrow this empire and build up their own new thing, whilst there's just a huge, epic, world-ending story going on. This is so fun. I highly recommend checking it out. Mistborn is one of my favorite series. The only critique I'd have for it is a critique I'd have for a lot of Brandon's books is he's very good at just weaving a plot and having everything tie together at the end. So sometimes his books felt like there's just a lot of setup going on. They feel slow throughout, and then right in the last 100 to 200 pages, you get something called a Sanderlanche, where just all his storylines come together and things just go crazy and blow your mind. So you might sometimes get bored and feel things are going a little bit too slowly with his books until right up to the end. And if you are very well read, you might find Mistborn is a little bit too YA. You might find Brandon's prose is a little bit too plain. They're the common critiques you'll find for this series. So I find this is a fantastic place to start if you're new to reading and new to fantasy. But if you're not as new to reading, if you're not new to fantasy, you'd be much better served going with something like Realm of the Elderlings or the Kingkiller Chronicles. Now, number 4, you won't have to worry about me rambling on too much about this one because it's a Game of Thrones, a Song of Ice and Fire. I'm assuming you've seen the series and you know what it's about. These are some of the best written books in the world of fantasy. George R. R. Martin and A Game of Thrones, the series, or Song of Ice and Fire, the book series, are as popular as they are for good reason. This world is huge. George has created a world that is just rich with history and is completely alive. He's got a writing style that makes his world feel more real. He uses older language, so you're able to just get in that time period very easily. And he does an incredible job getting inside his characters' heads, so you just feel like your characters are incredibly real. And he does a great job doing morally grey characters. So they're not exactly characters we like, but they're characters we are very interested and invested in. This is a series that will probably never get finished. So if that is one of the things that bothers you, it's probably not something you will want to start. But there's 5 incredible books already out, so you can just have a great time with those 5 books. As this is already a very popular series, I won't spend any more time on it. So we'll go on to number 3, which is the First Law Universe by Joe Abercrombie. This is 9 books, 3 separate trilogies. We have the First Law trilogy, the First Law Universe books, which are 3 standalones that take place in between this trilogy and the last trilogy, the Age of Madness trilogy, which basically follows the kids of the main cast in the first trilogy. Summing up First Law in as fewer words as possible, this takes all your classic fantasy tropes, like a hero's journey, the coming of age story, good versus evil, a country-ending invasion, a story of good versus evil, and turns it on its head. So rather than good versus evil, it's country versus country. Now, there is a little bit of good versus evil in the background, but primarily it's just our main characters that are not good people. They are just people, and has them just serving their own interests, but trying to save their country. So Joe does a great job writing morally grey characters. So instead of getting our good versus evil with our hero's journey, our hero in this book is the most stuck up, spoiled person. Our wise old wizard is kind of an ass. And all of our characters are very self-serving and looking after their own interests. Joe does a great job inserting a lot of humor into his books as well. So if you want a good laugh, you can get into the First Law series. His books are very gritty and real feeling. You just feel so immersed in his world when you're reading his books. So if you want some good action, if you want incredible characters, a good world, something that'll make you laugh, and just some really good writing, the First Law universe would serve you well. And out of all the series we're talking about today, it is one of the ones I would recommend most. Now, number 2, we have Lord of the Rings. You should have a good idea of what this is about. Now, should you read it or not? That is a better question than what is this book about? Yes, if you love fantasy, you have to read The Lord of the Rings at some point because it is the series that started all of this. Like Dune and Lord of the Rings did more for the fantasy and sci-fi genre than a lot of other books. Especially Lord of the Rings, it did a lot for setting up what modern fantasy is today. But it might not be the best books to go and read if you are looking for something like the Lord of the Rings movies that have a lot of action. The Lord of the Rings is a lot more world building and going on a journey, more so than your thrilling ride like Red Rising, where you're just running around with a lightsaber basically. But if you just want a beautiful writing style, you want to get swept away into another world, you want to get fully immersed in the history and the background of this world and this culture, you should check out Lord of the Rings. And at some point you should read it, but don't feel like it has to be your first read because it might not be your favorite thing. It's okay to not love this series. They aren't going to be everyone's cup of tea, but they are very well written. They are as popular as they are for good reason. Just if you're looking for a great character journey, it's like action heavy, it might not be the place to go to next. Now, the number 1 on Reddit's top fantasy series at the time of making this video is the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson. The 3rd time we have seen him on this list, as Brandon was the author to finish off the Wheel of Time after Robert Jordan passed, and he also wrote the Mistborn books. Now, the Stormlight Archive is Brandon's magnum opus. This is his big fantasy series. It is currently 5 books out, which completes the first arc of this series, and then in another 20 years, he'll have the next 5 books out to make this a 10-book whole series. to make this a 10-book series. Now, these books are absolutely massive. I'm pretty sure one of these books is bigger than the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy, but I could be wrong on that. And this series just takes everything of modern fantasy and dials it up to 10. So this is a very unique world. We live in a world that is swept by storms on a regular basis. Huge storms that have rocks flying through and just decimating everything. So the whole world just feels completely different. Like there's no just regular plants because they'll just get swept away by storms. Our plants are basically like crabs. So everything can curl up into a shell and just lock into the ground. And the magic systems are way out there. But for me, the highlight of the Stormlight Archive, it's the characters and it's the exploration that Brandon Sanderson does with the characters' mental health. Each of our main characters have a pretty full-on mental health condition that Brandon is trying to explore. So my favorite character, Kaladin, is a very depressed man. So we get quite a full-on exploration of that throughout the series. We have another girl, Shallan, who is in deep denial about her past and has found a way to cope with that, which you'll find out more and more of as you go through the books. And we also have Dalinar, who has quite the past, as you'll find out later in the series. Now, this is a classic good versus evil story where Brandon just showcases his world building and plot work to the absolute max. These books are long and slow. They are drawn out. They are broken into 5 parts, and they weave together just to have the most chaotic and beautiful endings. I personally haven't finished this series, the 5th book. I found the characters' voices changed in the end of the last book, but a lot of people who were able to finish the last book had a great time with it. This is a big commitment to get into. I think the first 2 books are 2 of the best books I have ever read in fantasy. The way he's able to weave the story, bring things together, the great character moments are just incredible and worth it. But just know these books are over 50 hours of listening time. They are quite full-on experiences. If you are looking to start fantasy, this is what people love. This is what is most well loved, but it's also a big commitment. So just know that going in. So that's our Reddit top 15. Now, there's just a couple other series I want to talk to you about. And I wanted to start with the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne, which is the book series that got me back reading. Now, I don't have book 1 with me as I currently have that lent out to a friend as I wanted to show them it. But this is a Viking-inspired trilogy. So this is in a Norse setting, in a small country. It's a story where we only have 3 POVs, so it's very easy to follow. John Gwynne has a very easy-to-read writing style, and there's not too much magic going on in this world. I picked up this series because of the covers. I was walking through the bookstore, saw the cover for book 1, just an incredible, huge dragon in like a snowscape setting. Absolutely beautiful. I picked it up and I flew through it. We are following characters that are set on paths of revenge. We have found family going on. We have characters trying to prove their worth and their destiny. We have gods trying to return to this world where gods have been gone for the last 300 years because they almost killed themselves off. It's just a huge epic tale in a very fun Icelandic saga. I highly recommend that if you just want some fun Viking reads. Another series by John Gwynne that I like even more than the Bloodsworn Saga are his The Faithful and the Fallen books, which is basically a story of good versus evil in a medieval Europe. You've got angels on one side, demons on the other, and they just sweep a whole continent into war. There's a ton of great action. John Gwynne is most known for his action scenes. He writes action better than any other author I've ever read, and his battles just live in your mind for years after finishing the books. So if you want a medieval Europe at war with giants riding bears and just a prophecy with the chosen one saving the day, but that prophecy gets twisted on its head, you should check out these books. Incredible action. It's just super easy to read, a ton of characters, POVs, really good politics, but even better action. Fantastic time. But lastly, the Bound and the Broken series by Ryan Cahill. This series is currently coming out. It's not completed just yet. But if you want a story of rebellion, if you want dragons and action and just a thrilling story that's easy to read, you should check out The Bound and the Broken. There's currently 3 main novels out, 3 novellas out, and 2 more books to come for this series. It's set in a world where dragon riders used to keep the peace and order on this continent with multiple countries. But 400 years ago, a mage teamed up with some disgruntled riders and wiped out most of the order of the dragon riders. Now, this whole continent has been living under this oppressive mage for the last 400 years, and there's been no new dragons hatched to hatch. There's only a few dragon riders left that still work under this mage, and this whole continent is just needing something to spark a rebellion. Basically, a dragon egg comes into existence and rebellion is sparked, and now we are fighting back against this oppressive rule. It's a very classic world, so you get elves, dwarves, humans, dragons, and some orc-like beings. It's very fun, but it's written in a very modern writing style, so it's very easy to read and fly through. It's very quick pacing, lots of action. It's a ton of fun, really good character moments. Great place to start reading fantasy, and it's one of the ones I read early on. But guys, that is my intro to fantasy. I hope I was able to introduce you to something new and you can find your next read. Please let me know what questions you have about fantasy, where you should go next, and have a great day.